This is, as the rabbi has mentioned in shul, this is my 25th year teaching this adult education class. So I just want to say it's been a real pleasure and honor to be able to do this for so many years. And it continues to be a fun thing for me to prepare for and to engage in these lectures and discussions with you. For those of you who have been attending these classes for many years, you'll remember that for the first number of years, I addressed various issues related to the oral law, the Torah Shebe'al Peh. And in more recent years, I have chosen themes in which I am particularly interested. We have discussed, among other themes in Jewish intellectual history, chosenness, messianism, free will, social justice. Those are just a few of the ones that come to my mind at the moment. I am generally interested in Jewish intellectual history, so tracing the development of ideas within the Jewish tradition. And over the last number of years, I have spent a couple of classes dedicated to my teachers and my mentors during my graduate studies in Jewish studies. First, the great historian Yosef Yerushalmi, who passed away. Each time I gave these classes after my teachers had died. So first it was Yosef Yerushalmi, and then last year I focused on the thought of David Weiss Halivni, the great Talmudic scholar who was my closest advisor during my graduate program. I'm now turning back to back to the basics, some fundamentals about the Jewish tradition, and in particular, the Jewish legal system that is really at the heart of the Jewish tradition. The study of Torah and all of its various aspects, including its mitzvot, but the halachic Jewish legal system that is based on the Torah is really at the heart of Jewish thought. There are, of course, many other interesting things to study in the Jewish tradition: philosophy, Kabbalah, poetry, but really the Jewish legal system, I think, is at the heart of Jewish thinking, Jewish life, Jewish practice for millennia. So I'm turning back to what I think is a fundamental aspect of the Jewish legal tradition. And through our focus on this theme, I'm hoping that we learn about the dynamics and the development of the Jewish legal tradition in particular, how it developed in light of certain thresholds in the Torah that seem to inhibit such development. So that's we're going to get at very basic aspects of the growth and development of the Jewish legal system that is at the heart, I believe, at the heart of Judaism. So welcome everyone to this 25th annual course. Just logistically, I will pause toward the middle for any questions. So please hold your questions until then. And then at the end of my talk, there'll be time for additional questions. So I'm hoping that that we'll keep this to, it's certainly less than an hour and a half. And depending on the length of the question sessions, and I hope you will find it interesting. Let me start with a basic framework for our discussion. The framework is simple, but I want everyone to keep it in mind because we modern Jews, I think, sometimes are a little bit out of touch or out of tune with classical assumptions about Jewish thought, and I want us to inhabit and occupy that environment, the environment of classical Jewish thought, so we can understand how it developed and how it developed into the modern Judaism that we experience today. So the classical framework that I want to introduce, there are many, of course, many classical doctrines, again, some of which I have taught about in prior years. But at a very basic level, the classical framework that I want us to keep in mind is that the Torah reflects divine revelation. I'm using as a shorthand Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai in the Torah, in the Torah recounts the great revelation at Mount Sinai. I'm using Mount Sinai as sort of a proxy for all of the revelations that took place in the wilderness. During the travels of the Israelites in the wilderness, there were additional revelations after Sinai within that 40-year period. But I'm using as a proxy for all of that the revelation at Mount Sinai, which was the foundational font of all of that divine revelation. So the Torah conveys that revelation to us. The Torah is the foundational text of Judaism. It is granted superior and supreme status within the Jewish legal system. So anything that is rooted in the Torah has an elevated status above everything that is not, because the Torah reflects God's communication to us of his word and his will. So the Torah is the prism through which we can understand what God wants of us, both what he wants us to do and what he wants us to avoid doing. And as a result, everything, because the Torah reflects God's will and his word, everything in the Torah is meaningful. Every detail in it is meaningful. That's how the rabbinic sages approach the text. And we must take it, as classical Jews, we must take it very seriously, because there are both life-affirming and life-threatening consequences if we are not obedient to God's will. The Torah tells us that if we fulfill the commandments, we will be rewarded, and if we fail to perform them, we will be punished. That is the classical Jewish system. It reminds me another theme I've addressed in the past is reward and punishment. So the Torah conveys a system of reward and punishment that makes very clear that our obedience to the Torah text is of supreme importance. We have to take it with the utmost seriousness and faithfulness. And the Torah itself occupies the highest stratum in our Jewish tradition. So I'm sure you're all familiar with those, but I want to make sure that we keep those classical principles and assumptions about the Torah in mind. Because as modern Jews, we don't take them for granted, but we have challenged those assumptions in many ways. And I want us to, in order to understand how we got to where we are now, I think it's important to understand where we came from. And most Jews, not all Jews, but most Jews shared the assumptions that I just tried to convey about the divine status of the Torah. So with that background, I'm going to share my, hold on just a moment. Okay, I'm hoping that everyone can see my source sheet now. And as this reflects, this is my 25th annual class. I've entitled this, "You Shall Not Add Anything." That is a quote that we'll see from the Torah. And the subtitle is, "Did Torah Begin and End at Sinai?" And my the first session here is entitled "The Torah's No Amendment Clause." You may not have thought that there was anything about amendments in the Torah, but I think there is, and that will be the subject of our discussion today. That the fact that the Torah actually has a no amendment clause, and how that affected the development of the Jewish legal tradition in light of commandments, not just statements, but commandments in the Torah that suggest that amendments are impermissible. So the first text is from Deuteronomy. Many of these initial texts will be from the book of Dvarim, of Deuteronomy, the fifth and last book of the Chumash, of the Torah itself. So this is the fifth of the most important books in our Hebrew Bible. And in chapter 4, it says, "And now, Israel, give heed to the laws and rules that I, God, am instructing you to observe." I could there mean God or Moses. These are Moses's instructions, but Moses is simply a mouthpiece, a vehicle for conveying God's instructions and God's revelation. Rules that I am instructing you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Then here is the operative verse. "You shall not add anything to what I command you, or take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you." The Hebrew is "Lo tosifu al hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem, ve'lo tigra'u mimenu." I'm going to refer to, and I'll occasionally remind you what the translation is, but this is referred to in the Jewish tradition as the commandments or the clauses of Bal Tosif, you shall not add, and Bal Tigra, you should not subtract from or take away detract from the Torah. So those are considered, by the way, separate commandments in the Torah. If we stipulate that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, Taryag Mitzvot, these are two of them. That Bal Tosif and Bal Tigra, you shall not add and you shall not take away, are two commandments that God is telling us in the Torah. So that seems to be a no amendment clause. God is saying through Moses, his mouthpiece, don't take anything away from what I am currently revealing to you. Don't add to it and don't take away anything from it. Effectively, you have no permission, no authority, no entitlement to alter, to amend, or adjust what I am revealing to you. So, to be clear, for example, Article 5 of the United States Constitution is an amendment clause. There is an amendment clause in the U.S. Constitution that says, here is the way to propose and to ratify amendments. And as we know, there have been many amendments to the U.S. Constitution. In contrast, in very explicit terms, in contrast, the Torah is saying, not only is there the absence of an amendment clause, so the absence of anything like what I just said there does exist in the U.S. Constitution, but the opposite is the case. There's actually a no amendment clause. Don't add anything, don't take away anything from what I'm revealing to you. And just to make it clear, Deuteronomy basically says it again. Be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you, neither add to it nor take away from it. I will note, and there is some legal significance to this within the Jewish system. I'm going to get back, by the way, I'm going to get back in further detail about all of the things that we're talking about today. I'm trying to set up the problem today. The problem is, how did the Jewish tradition evolve and grow and adapt to circumstances in light of these explicit no amendment clauses in the Torah itself? So I will get back to all of these general principles in further detail, both later in this lecture and in the following two. But the Deuteronomy has not just one, but two no amendment clauses. I will note for the Hebrew speakers, this second one you'll see is in the singular. Lo tosef alav velo tigra mimenu, whereas the first was lo tosifu and lo tigra'u. There may be legal significance attached to the plural form in the first and the singular in the second. Again, as I mentioned earlier, classical Jewish readers of the Torah attributed supreme importance to every detail in the Torah. And this is a detail that they would have noticed, that the first is in the plural, the second in the singular. But putting that aside for the time being, There are two no amendment clauses in the Torah. Further, Deuteronomy also says, this is in the context of the people telling Moses, oh, we can't really abide the intimacy of this interaction with God. God is too overwhelming, God's presence is too overpowering for us. Moses, please, you be our intermediary. You be the medium through which we hear and receive God's revelation. So the people said to Moses, you go closer and hear all that the Lord our God says, and then you tell us, you Moses, tell us everything that the Lord our God tells you, and we will willingly do it. God heard the plea that you made to me, and God said to me, to Moses, if everyone could mute themselves, please.
This is around the trees in the bed.
I have heard the plea that this people made to you. They did well to speak thus. May they always be of such mind to revere me, God, and follow all my God's commandments, that it may go well with them and with their children forever. Could everyone please mute themselves? Go say to them, return to your tents, but you, Moses, remain here with me, and I will give you the whole instruction. So in the Hebrew, I will give you the whole instruction, the laws and the rules that you shall impart to them, implying at least that the Torah that is being revealed to Moses to convey to the people is comprehensive, is all-encompassing in nature for them to observe in the land that I am giving them to possess. And it continues, be careful then to do as your Lord God has commanded you. Do not turn aside to the right or to the left. Follow only the path that your Lord God has enjoined upon you, so that you may thrive and that it may go well with you and that you may long endure in the land you are to possess. Can I just say, if you have not muted yourself, please do that. So please check your computer or phone to see that you are muted.
I think Reed, I think you're not muted.
Okay, so the first two texts are explicit amendment clauses. This third one that I just read at least implies that the revelation to be conveyed by Moses to the people is all-encompassing in nature. And so we have the sense that the Torah that is being conveyed, Reed, you're still not muted. The Torah is all-encompassing in nature. And further, there are texts that suggest that the prophetic quality of the revelation that is being conveyed to Moses is unique, that Moses as prophet, as the intermediary through which the revelation is being conveyed to the people, is one of a kind. Numbers had said, and God said to Aaron and Miriam, they had spoken badly about Moses because of his marriage to a Cushite woman. God said to them, hear these my words. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to them in a vision. I speak with him in a dream, meaning with respect to other non-Mosaic prophets. Not so with my servant Moses. He is trusted throughout my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses? So even back in Numbers, the fourth book of the Torah, we have the sense that God is saying Moses is a unique prophet. There is no other vehicle of God's revelation that can compare to Moses. And Deuteronomy then subsequently makes that very explicit. This is right near the end of the Torah, near the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom God singled out face to face. You may recognize that in our Yigdal prayer. The prayer sort of riffs off this verse, which establishes very clearly that Moses, as a prophetic vehicle of God's revelation at Mount Sinai and in the wilderness wanderings was absolutely one of a kind. He was unique, and never again did there arise a prophet like Moses, suggesting that the type of revelation that we experienced and received at Mount Sinai and in the wilderness via Moses will never again be duplicated. Having said all that, though, Deuteronomy then, perhaps surprisingly, says, "From among your own people, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like myself." This is Moses talking and saying, well, in fact, despite everything that I've just suggested about the uniqueness of God and the all-encompassing revelation that Moses conveyed to the people, that perhaps will not be the case. That is whom you shall heed, meaning you shall heed prophets like Moses. And that phrase is obscure and not clear, but perhaps there will be in the future prophets like Moses. Ellie, could you mute yourself, please?
It's not muted. It's not muted.
Can you hear him?
Yes, but it's not muted. They can hear us. They don't want to hear us.
Hold on just a second.
You know they
Okay, thank you. This is just what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, "Let me not hear the voice of my Lord God any longer, or see this wondrous fire anymore, lest I die." Again, the people were concerned about the overwhelming nature of the divine revelation. They wanted Moses to be the intermediary through which the revelation was conveyed to them. Whereupon the Lord said to me, to Moses, "They have done well in speaking to us. I will raise up for them from among their own people a prophet like yourself, like you, Moses, in whose mouth I will put my words, and who will speak to them all that I command. And anybody who fails to heed the words that future prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call to account." So despite what I referenced earlier from Deuteronomy and from the book of Numbers about the uniqueness of Moses as prophet and as the intermediary to convey God's revelation, here in this passage, God is saying, well, in fact, I may produce and generate among you Israelites another prophet just like Moses, which gives rise to the possibility that the Sinai revelation could be continued or supplemented or amended at some later time. So I'm drawing forth passages about prophecy from the Torah that interact with the no amendment clause, because the existence, the possibility of future prophecy generates the at least theoretical possibility of future revelations that will compete with, that will rival the Sinaitic revelation, that will perhaps add to it or take away from it or amend it in some way. So the possibility of future prophecy is a problematic feature of this tradition in Deuteronomy, that prophets just like Moses may arise in the future. That is a problem vis-a-vis the no amendment clauses that we started with. So, in light of the theoretical possibility that there will be future prophets like Moses, the question arises, how do you tell? How do you know which person who says, oh, by the way, I'm a prophet just like Moses, how do you know if they're real, if they're genuine or not? Deuteronomy says, "But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name a matter that I did not command him to utter, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die." And should you ask yourselves the very appropriate and good and suitable question, how can we know that the matter was not spoken by God? If someone arises and says, oh, by the way, I'm speaking on behalf of your God, Israelites, and here's what your God is telling you to do through me. And oh, by the way, I'm telling you that perhaps the Torah should be changed in this way or that. The people could very appropriately wonder, well, how do we know if this guy is telling us the truth? And so Deuteronomy tells us, if the prophet speaks in the name of God and the matter does not come true, there are various aspects of prophecy, but one aspect of prophecy is divining the future, is predicting the future. So Deuteronomy is saying, well, if someone claims prophecy and they say that something is going to happen in the future, but it doesn't come true, that matter was not spoken by God. And so that quote, I put the quotations there, that prophet, that false prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in dread of him because he is fraudulent. So the test that is articulated here in Deuteronomy seems to be that if someone claims prophetic powers, but their prediction about the future does not come true, you know that person is not a genuine prophet. Now that sounds like it might be straightforward, but it's really not so clear. And by the way, I will note, you could argue, well, a lot of prophecy has nothing to do with predicting the future. That is certainly true. There are various other roles and functions of prophets in the Jewish tradition to reprimand the people, to try to get them to repent, to convey laws, like Moses did after the Mount Sinai revelation and in the wilderness wanderings. So there are other roles that prophets play, but the idea of sort of predicting the future is almost always present. And let me point out that even in his law-giving capacity, even in Moses' sort of legislative capacity in conveying the laws of God to the people, Moses also said, as I intimated earlier, if you keep these commandments that I'm conveying to you from God, if you keep them, Israelites, you will be rewarded, and you will live long in the land, and you will have bountiful fruits, etc. And if you disobey the commandments that I am conveying you, the divine commandments that I'm conveying you, you will be punished. Your crops will not be bountiful. You will be thrown out of the land, perhaps. You will be subjected to the control of foreign nations. So there are consequences, rewards, and punishments attached to the fulfillment of law. So even Moses, when he was in his legislative capacity of providing laws, was also a predictor in some sense of the future, because obedience to the law or disobedience to the law had certain consequences that would prove true, that would be realized, that would be materialized in the future. So we have this test. Okay, if the prophecy about the future comes true, then you know that the prophet was genuine. And if it doesn't come true, the prophet was fraudulent. Deuteronomy also has other guidelines to flesh this out. If there appears among you a prophet or a dream diviner who gives you a sign or a portent saying, let us follow and worship another God, whom you have not experienced, even if the sign or portent that he named to you comes true, do not heed the words of that prophet or that dream diviner. For the Lord your God is testing you to see whether you really love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. So Deuteronomy is saying, by the way, God is saying, I might fake you out sometimes. I might present a prophet or someone who claims to be a prophet who says, such and such will happen in the future. And Deuteronomy is saying, even if the sign or portent that he named to you comes true. So we just had a test that said, oh, if the prediction about the future comes true, you know that the prophet is genuine. That's not always the case, because Deuteronomy says, if the prophet says, let's worship another God, by definition, essentially, that prophet cannot be genuine, even if they seem to have powers of prophetic prediction, and those predictive powers are proven to be true. So this test of truthfulness of prediction is somewhat of a slippery slope and not always reliable. As Deuteronomy makes clear, the message of the prophet is also germane to figuring out whether the prophet is genuine or not. And then Deuteronomy makes clear further, it is the Lord your God alone whom you should follow, whom you should revere, whose commandments you should observe, whose orders you should heed, whom you should worship, and to whom you should hold fast. As for that fraudulent prophet or dream diviner who suggests doing otherwise, deviating, diverging from what God has told you to do, such a one shall be put to death for having urged disloyalty to the Lord your God, to make you stray from the path that the Lord your God commanded you to follow. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. So this is a serious thing. To identify fraudulent prophets is a concern of Deuteronomy, because having stated that there may be future Moses-like prophets, we have to have the ability to discern and distinguish genuine prophets who might have Moses-like capacity to reveal God's will from those who are fraudulent and who are motivated by unrighteous motivations to get the people to deviate from God's will. So both the message and the predictive quality of the prophecy are both important. If the message is, don't do what God has told you to do, you know that prophet is not genuine. But short of that, the Torah really is not crystal clear about how we will be able to identify genuine prophets who may have a message about deviating to some degree, let's say adjusting the laws of the Torah or supplementing the laws of the Torah. So supplementing would not be nullifying the Torah, but a prophet who urges us to supplement the Torah would be at odds with the no amendment clauses that we started with earlier. Getting back to this idea of the test of a prophet, if a prophet predicts the future, and the Deuteronomy initially said, oh, if the prophecy comes true, you will know that the prophet is real, is genuine. And we saw that that's not necessarily the case, because it depends on their message as well. But that test of the future accuracy of a prophecy is played out in the book of Jonah, which we read on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. We all know this story, but this has always been an interesting feature to me. Jonah, as we know, resisted God's instruction to give this message to the non-Jewish city of Nineveh to repent. He didn't want to give the message, but why? Why didn't he want to give the message? It says Jonah went at once to Nineveh in accordance with God's command. So this is after he actually went to Nineveh, after resisting and after being swallowed by the whale type creature in the sea. Jonah actually, despite his initial resistance, went to Nineveh. Nineveh was an enormously large city, a 3 days walk across. He started out and made his way into the city, the distance of 1 day's walk, and proclaimed 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That sounds like a pretty definitive statement. In 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown because of Nineveh's wickedness. But the people actually did tshuva. They actually repented. The people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and great and small alike put on sackcloth, etc. And so they had a genuine tshuva process, and God accepted them. And then it says, God saw what they did, how they were turning back from their evil ways, and God renounced the punishment that had been planned for them and did not carry it out. This displeased Jonah greatly, and he was grieved. One might ask, why was Jonah displeased if he was trying to get them to repent and they followed his instruction to repent? Because Jonah perhaps was not the highest form of prophet, and he did not want his prediction to be proven untrue. But he had a feeling it would be, because God is a forgiving God, and so if the people repented, the people of Nineveh repented, God would relent in terms of his decree of destruction. And Jonah didn't want it to be the case that he predicted something about the future that would not take place. And he says, that is why I fled beforehand to Tarshish, for I know that you are a compassionate and gracious God, etc. Please, Eternal One. He was so aggrieved by the fact that his prophecy, his prediction about the future was proven to be untrue, that he says, oh, I'd rather die than live in light of this outcome. Now that's, to me, that displays not the highest level of prophecy. Jonah presumably should have been pleased that the people performed repentance in light of his message, but for him, he didn't appreciate the fact that his prophecy, his prediction about the future, proved untrue. So we have this problem about the test that was given in Deuteronomy, of whether you can know that a prophet is genuine if his prediction about the future is true. We've seen that that's problematic. And Maimonides, in his great code, the Mishnah Torah, says the above, and I'm adding here a little just to give you context, the above principles regarding the proper identification of a false prophet do not apply to prophecies of retribution, which a prophet will utter. So prophecies of sort of destruction and unfavorable outcomes, for example, so-and-so will die, this or that year will be a year of famine or a year of war, and the like. So of the kind that Jonah gave to the people of Nineveh. Because if his words do not come true, this does not nullify the validity of his prophecy, nor do we say about him, behold, he spoke and his words were not fulfilled. This is because, as Jonah recognized, the Holy One is slow to anger and is forgiving. Thus, it is possible that they, the people, the objects of the prediction, the prophecy, will repent and their sin will be forgiven, as in the case of the people of Nineveh and Jonah's prophecy regarding their imminent doom. But the test about the predictive quality of a prophecy does apply if the prophet is saying that something good will happen. If a prophet promised that good would come and such will occur, and the good about which he prophesied did not materialize, he is surely a false prophet. Any good which God decrees, even if the decree is provisional, will never be nullified. We can conclude from this that a prophet should be tested on the basis of his favorable prophecies. So the test, Maimonides is clarifying, only is operative when a prophet says good things will happen, not as in the case of Jonah when he says bad things will happen, because God could always relent on the basis of tshuva of the people at issue who may be subject to the prediction of doom. If they do proper tshuva, God might relent. So the test in Deuteronomy, the Rambam Maimonides is clarifying, is operative only if a prophet says something good will take place. So that clarifies a bit the test of how do we recognize a genuine post-Mosaic prophet. But despite the fact that Deuteronomy seems to suggest that even in light of the no amendment clauses that are articulated twice in the book of Deuteronomy, it nevertheless seems to suggest at least a theoretical possibility that there will be future Moses-like prophets who could potentially have the capacity to reveal additional aspects of revelation that at minimum could supplement the Sinai revelation, which itself would be inconsistent with a verse that says, do not add to the Torah. The whole idea of the theoretical possibility of future prophecy to the later rabbinic sages who were interpreting the Torah was problematic, was challenging, because the rabbis did not really feel comfortable with the idea that future prophets could come and somehow add to or adjust the dictates of the divine revelation as embodied in the Torah that was for them the foundational text of their lives. Leviticus chapter 27 says, Elah hamitzvot asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe b'nei Yisrael b'har Sinai. These are the commandments that God gave Moses for the Israelites on Mount Sinai. Pretty straightforward verse. But the rabbis, this is from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Shabbat, make a lot out of this seemingly straightforward and simple verse. They wrote, isn't it written, these are the commandments? They're focused on this Hebrew word, Eleh hamitzvot. So they're just quoting the two words at the beginning of this Hebrew verse from Leviticus. So again, they're attributing great importance to a single word in the Torah, because these words were God's words, and so every single word in the Torah can convey something important to us. So out of the word these, Elah, they say the word these underscores that a prophet is not permitted to innovate any new element related to the Torah and mitzvot from here on, meaning after the revelations at Mount Sinai in the wilderness. Ein hanavi rashai lechadesh davar me'ata, or me'ata. So this idea that the rabbis really highlight is that prophecy no longer has the capacity. It's not just no longer, centuries later, but at any time after Sinai, prophets did not have the authority or power or capacity to add to anything in the Torah, even if they had prophetic powers. It was not within their right to supplement what had been stated in the Torah, which would be consistent with the no amendment clauses that we started with. And so here's another text from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Bava Batra, which makes clear the rabbis' discomfort with the idea of prophecy, and not insignificantly, this could have been in light of the growth of Christianity. At the center of Christianity was supposedly a new prophet, Jesus, the Son of God, in fact, who had come to earth to tell us all sorts of things about the Torah, and Jesus was construed subsequently to be communicating that the Torah, what became known to Christians as the Old Testament, had been superseded by a new revelation. So the rabbis of the Talmud had a heightened sensitivity, I think, to prophecy being used as the vehicle of superseding or nullifying or altering or amending the existing Torah. And in this tractate, Rabbi Yochanan said, from the day that the second temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to imbeciles and children. It's an obscure statement, but I think what Rabbi Yochanan was saying, with the disappearance, the destruction of the temple, there is not even the theoretical possibility of prophecy. And I think what he has in mind is, oh yeah, imbeciles and children may occasionally get something right about what might happen in the future, but there's no genuine prophecy anymore. And so to the extent there have been prophets in the centuries after the Torah was revealed, they really had no capacity to alter the Torah as given through Moses. But in any event, starting in our era, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, after the destruction of the temple, in the absence of the divine presence through the temple, there's not even the theoretical possibility that prophetic capacity will emerge among us. So they essentially create a dead end for prophecy. Prophecy will no longer have any capacity or possibility of altering the divine revelation as given at Mount Sinai. Again, turning to Maimonides in his Code, the Mishneh Torah, sort of sums up a lot of what we've been talking about. Maimonides writes, if a person will arise, whether Jew or Gentile, so he is aware of other religions that have claimed that the Torah has been superseded, essentially amended either partially or in its entirety by subsequent revelations. By the time of Maimonides, of course, there had not just been Jesus, but there had been Muhammad. So there had been other prophets who had gained enormous popularity, who said the Torah is a thing of the past. And Maimonides wants to make clear, if a person will arise, whether Jew or Gentile, and perform a sign or wonder, that may be genuine, that may seem to reflect real prophetic power, and say that God sent him to add a mitzvah, withdraw a mitzvah commandment, explain a commandment in a manner which differs from the tradition received from Moses, or if he says that the commandments commanded to the Jews are not permanent, are not forever, are not permanently binding, but rather were given for a limited time, like Jesus did, or as Jesus was interpreted to reveal, yes, the Torah may have been, the Old Testament may have been operative for a certain time, but now it's been superseded. He is a false prophet, Maimonides is saying, and making clear. the false prophet comes to deny the prophecy of Moses and should be executed by strangulation. So the death penalty should apply to such a false prophet because he dared to make statements in God's name that God never made. So that's sort of a good summary that Maimonides provides for us about someone who purports to be a prophet post the revelation of Moses, whose message is, oh, by the way, let's add to the Torah or take away from the Torah, or let's explain it in a way that that our tradition says the Torah means, or that that indicates that the Torah is only of provisional nature and not permanent nature. That is, by definition, a false prophet. We will know that that person's prophecy is false. He's giving guidance to Jews of his time about don't trust and put your faith in prophets. And by the way, it's not, I'll note too, that it's not just with respect to Christianity or Islam, but it's also with respect to Jewish false messiahs who claimed, several of whom claimed that the Torah could be suspended in terms of its application for a particular time, or that aspects of the Torah could be nullified. So this applies to Jewish false prophets and false messiahs as well. It's Maimonides' caution to the people. But Maimonides still has to deal with this issue. So why did the Torah, as we saw earlier in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Deuteronomy 18 said, I will raise up a prophet for the people, like you, Moses. God is saying, I will have Moses-like prophets in the future. So Maimonides is saying, well, what's the point of having such Moses-like prophets if they can't really do anything effective vis-a-vis the original revelation at Mount Sinai? And so Maimonides solves that problem by saying this post-Mosaic prophet is not coming to make new law. So he is affirming the no amendment clause, the Baal Tosif and Baal Tigra clauses, don't add to and don't subtract from the Torah. So any such post-Mosaic prophet that is genuine is not coming to make new law, but only to reinforce the words of the Torah and to warn the people not to violate them. So Maimonides is making clear any subsequent Moses-like prophet, their only job is to reinforce the existing Torah and not to change it or add to it in any way. I'm going to have a couple more texts, and then I will open it up for any questions before we move on. So the rabbis, what I've tried to make clear in the last few texts is that the rabbis were concerned about sort of restricting, limiting, confining the capacity of prophecy to amend in any way, to supplement, detract from, nullify, to amend the original Sinaitic revelation as reflected in the Torah. And again, the classical Jewish thinking is, and the assumption was, the 5 books of Moses, essentially, in their entirety were revealed through Moses at Mount Sinai and through the remainder of the wilderness wanderings. So they are of divine provenance and status. The rabbis were concerned to cabin the capacity of prophecy to amend that Torah in any way. Deuteronomy, and I want to show you how the rabbis used their own capacity to interpret the Torah to make clear that even God did not have the capacity to amend God's own Torah as revealed at Mount Sinai. Deuteronomy 30 says, surely this instruction, which is a translation of the word mitzvah in this text, surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens. Lo vashamayim. So this is an important phrase that recurs in various famous passages in rabbinic literature. It is not, but here it has its own meaning in the book of Deuteronomy, that the Torah is accessible, that we don't need all sorts of intermediaries to understand it, to perform its dictates. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? No, the thing is very close to you in your mouth and in your heart to observe it. So in its own context, this passage, which became famous subsequently in rabbinic literature, I think is really simply the pshat, the plain sense, is telling us the Torah is not some arcane, complex revelation. It is accessible. You people can understand it, and therefore can and should be able to observe it and fulfill God's will as reflected in this revelation. The rabbis, though, took this fairly straightforward passage and again exploited it, and I say that not derogatorily, but sort of invoked it to great effect in terms of the enterprise that they were engaged in, which was interpreting the Torah and trying to understand the details of what God really wanted from them. This is from a story that I have taught in greater detail in prior years, but I'm not going to focus on the story, just a little piece of it. So this is the famous story of the oven of Achnai, in which there was a debate between two rabbis, Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer, about a certain quite complicated halachic Jewish legal issue. And toward the end of it, it says, and various miracles occurred in the Beit Midrash to favor Rabbi Eliezer, one of the disputants. But the other rabbi, Rabbi Yeshua, said that it is not in the heavens. He invokes this verse that we just read from Deuteronomy and explains it. And the Gemara says, what is the relevance of that phrase, it is not in the heavens, in the context of this rabbinic dispute? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, because the Torah was already given to us at Mount Sinai, we do not give heed to a divine voice. In the Hebrew, a bat kol, which may have other shadings of meaning, but it essentially means a voice from heaven. So we don't pay attention. We don't give any value to a divine voice that comes down to try to intervene in a rabbinic dispute like the one that we have in this tanur of Achnai, the oven of Achnai story. So even if God essentially comes down to the Beit Midrash and says, I favor the view of Rabbi X, we should pay no attention to that. And I think the rabbis here of the Talmud are making clear that by the time of Talmudic rabbinic disputation about what the Torah's meaning was in terms of fleshing out the details of what God wanted, God himself had no longer any capacity to alter or amend or even make clear what the Torah meant. The Torah, as revealed at Mount Sinai, meant to the people. So the age of prophecy and even essentially of divine intervention, divine revelation, there's some exceptions to this in Talmudic literature, but this is the predominant view that even God doesn't have the authority to intervene in rabbinic disputes. I'm going to pause there and welcome any questions before we move on to I'm going to start fleshing out what the no amendment clauses really have meant in the Jewish tradition. So any comments or questions or thoughts before we do move on?
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
The idea that you are obligated to follow the laws of the Torah, but God doesn't seem to follow some of those laws that he prescribes. There are many instances in the Torah where seemingly what he does or instigate is not what he says. I guess particular examples are, justice, 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 and you see many instances of injustice in the Torah. So, how do you reconcile that? How do the rabbis reconcile that? Do as I say, but not as I do.
Yeah, Hal, I don't think the rabbis would acknowledge any instances in the Torah of God's injustice, that justice is something that we should all pursue and that is embodied in God's presence in the world. Yes, there are many examples of injustice, but that the just on the verse that you reference, it doesn't mean that there's exclusively justice in the world. We all know that there's much injustice, but that we should pursue spreading justice in the world. But yes, the Torah is quite anthropomorphic. God seems to change his mind about various things as we move along in the Torah. But for the rabbis, that wasn't really a problem. In classical Jewish thought, God is perfect, as we'll see in a text that in the source sheet. God's Torah is perfect. The Torah is permanent, and so they didn't have some of the same problems that we moderns do in terms of inconsistencies that we might see in the Torah. They noted problems that they felt a need to address and interpret. There are issues in the Torah that have to be understood better, but the Torah for them didn't have the same sort of problems to resolve in the same way that I think we moderns have might think of it in a way that is different from the way the rabbis did. Jerry, is that your hand raised? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I did. The chronology may be inappropriate, but I wonder about Aaron and the golden calf. Now, that seems to be a really deep violation. Aaron was not considered a prophet, but his punishment was almost negligible. Could you expound on that?
Well, one can argue that perhaps his punishment was not negligible. Two of his sons were killed subsequently by in a very obscure episode. But that's the golden calf is considered the worst sin in the entire Torah. So that just represents a lapse in the Israelites' obedience to the revelation, not any amendment or alteration of the Torah itself. That was not an example of prophetic amendment. That was an example of Aaron faltering in accommodating the people's disobedience. So he was not considered a prophet in the sense of Moses. That was not considered a prophetic event. That was considered, a lapse in a terrible lapse in obedience.
But it wasn't a capital crime in any event?
Well, it's a very, I'm not going to get into the whole golden calf episode. It's a complicated event. It's considered a terrible sin. And so Aaron is faulted in the tradition with respect to his accommodation of the people's desire to worship something else. So he didn't get a pass, put it that way, even though he's allowed to continue living. Anyone else? Okay, so let me share my screen again. Okay, so now I'd like to move, and we'll see how many texts I can get through. But I want to move back to trying to flesh out our understanding of the no amendment clauses in the Torah, which I think, again, are crucially important because they illuminate how the tradition navigated or managed itself in the face of these no amendment clauses. How did the Jewish tradition develop and grow? As we all know, the Torah is in fact not self-sufficient. There was an entire tradition that had to grow up to accompany the Torah, to explain it to us so that we could understand better what God's will and word was as revealed to Moses. Again, this is all within classical Jewish thought. So it turns out that the Torah is not self-sufficient, but it does have these no amendment clauses. And so the tradition itself, the rabbinic sages through time, had to, while they were interpreting and fleshing out the details of the Torah, they had to ask themselves, well, is what we are doing in violation of these no amendment clauses? And by the way, again, the no amendment clauses are themselves commandments. They are two separate commandments among the 613, Bal Tosif and Bal Tikra, don't add to and don't detract, don't subtract from the Torah. So those are not just verses or clauses, they are actual commandments that we have to worry about abiding by and fulfilling. The rabbis, while they were engaged in their project of trying to flesh out the mandate of the Torah, and that's what they were doing in the Talmud and other rabbinic works, they had to keep in mind that the Torah itself has these no amendment clauses. Oh, by the way, don't add to the Torah, don't detract from it. And I'm going to focus more on the don't add to, because it seems pretty clear that the Jewish legal system as that we've inherited today is many multiples of what we find in the Torah. The Torah has commandments. Let's call them 613. But we have many more commandments than that. We have many more details than are reflected in the Torah itself. So the Jewish tradition embodies, let's say, 10 times or more the number of commandments in the Torah. So how does that reality comport with the no amendment clauses in Deuteronomy of not adding to the Torah? I'm going to focus on that. We'll mention the don't subtract from the Torah also. And by the way, the don't subtract from is certainly relevant to modern, more liberal Jewish denominations that have said, oh, we can dispense with that Jewish law, this or that Jewish law, including the conservative movement. So Bal Tigra, don't subtract from the Torah, is also highly relevant in contemporary Judaism. But with respect to the growth and development of the Jewish legal tradition itself, that is, again, I think at the heart of Jewish life and Jewish thought, I'm going to focus more on Bal Tosif, you shall not add. How did the rabbis engage in growing and developing the Jewish tradition in light of Bal Tosif? This text number 19 is from a medieval text called Sefer HaChinuch, the book of education from, I think it was 13th century Spain. It's actually an anonymous author. People speculate about who the author was, but we're not sure. And Sefer HaChinuch has become an important book explaining the 613 commandments. And for each, the author of the book identifies the commandment and explains what he thought were the philosophical underpinnings or the shoresh of each of each mitzvah, of each commandment. So with respect to Bal Tosif of this mitzvah, don't add to the Torah, that is stipulated in the book of Deuteronomy. The author wrote, and this book is still influential in traditional circles today, the philosophical underpinnings of the commandment of Bal Tosif is that the master of the world, God, who commanded us about the Torah, blessed be he, is completely perfect, and all of his acts and commands are perfect and good. And so adding to the perfect God's perfect revelation, as reflected in the Torah, adding to that amounts to a detraction. So we think we might be improving it in some way, but if we're adding to something that is already perfect, we're altering it in a way. And so even adding amounts to a detraction. In the Hebrew, v'hatosefet bahem chisaron. So one might think as a good Jew, oh, I'm just gonna improve the Torah by adding details to it. But this makes clear, no, the Torah, and I think this reflects the consensus of the rabbis about the Torah. The Torah itself is perfect. So in fleshing out the details, we're not improving it. We're perhaps understanding better what the Torah intends to convey to us, and what God intended to convey along with the Torah through the oral law or otherwise. But the Torah itself, the text that embodies the Sinaitic revelation, is perfect. And he ends by saying, and he says, all the more so subtracting. So if adding to it amounts to a detraction, of course, subtracting from it. So the Bal Tigra is, of course, taking away from the Sinaitic revelation, but even adding to it is a problem, because you don't add to a perfect entity. That only makes it worse. And he concludes by saying, Zed davar barur, this is a clear matter. This reflects, classical Jewish thinking about the perfection of the Torah and the Sinaitic revelation that it embodies. All right, so let's turn more specifically to this Baal Tosif, you shall not add, no amendment clause in Deuteronomy. So this goes back to the first text that I brought, text number 1 earlier. Here, I'll just show it to you again, so we all have it. Lo tosifu al hadavar asher anochi metzavetchem. You shall not add anything to what I command you, and you should not take away anything from it. That is the no amendment clause, the initial one that I referenced. And so the Rashi on that, that was the first one. The Rashi on that clause, lo tosifu, you shall not add. Rashi, the great medieval Jewish commentator, the most famous Jewish biblical commentator, really sort of sums up the rabbinic thinking. So he distills a lot of the rabbinic thinking about this commandment of not adding. We will get into this in greater detail, I promise you. But I wanted to give you what is really the essential distillation. What does you shall not add mean in practical terms for the rabbis? Again, the rabbis are engaged in this project of fleshing out the Torah so that they could live by it. They had to distill from it more details while not running afoul of the no amendment clause. So Rashi sums up what the rabbis have said about it. What does don't add to the Torah mean? It means, for instance, to place 5 biblical passages in the Tefillin. There are only 4. By the way, with respect to all of these, there are only 4. So there are 4 biblical passages on the scroll put in the phylacteries in Tefillin. And so if we said, oh, by the way, we're going to improve the Tefillin by putting 5 in. No, that runs afoul. That is a violation of the no amendment clause, or to employ 5 species of plants in the fulfillment of the commandment of lulav. As we know, there are 4 species of plants that comprise taking up the lulav and etrog on Sukkot. And so if you say, oh, I'm going to do hidur mitzvah, I'm going to beautify the commandment, the performance of the commandment by taking 5 species. No, that's a violation of Baal Tosif, of the no amendment clause. Or to place 5 fringes on one's garment. The 4-cornered garment, the rabbis tell us we need to put tzitzit, the strings attached to remind us of God's presence. And again, someone who might say, oh, I'm going to put even more on to be more devout, more pious. No, that's a violation of the no amendment clause. And similarly, we explain you shall not diminish from it. So a couple of things that one could infer from Rashi's summary of classical rabbinic thinking about this prohibition that are not self-evident. I want to make sure that we understand that Rashi is telling us what the rabbi is, the essence of the rabbi's view of the no amendment clause is, but that view is not self-evident, is not sort of apparent on its face, on the face of the no amendment clause itself. So Rashi is saying, implying at least very strongly, that the clause "do not add" only applies to existing mitzvot, existing commandments, because he only references 3. He references 3 that are existing. So tefillin, lulav, and tzitzit are all commandments from the Torah itself. So one might infer from this that the prohibition of not adding, of the no amendment clause, it only is operative with respect to existing commandments. And further, and perhaps even more sort of notably, it's really quantitative in nature, that it relates to sort of numbers associated with commandments. And again, in all 3 of these examples, the operative number is 4, and we can't add to that. we can't make 5 out of what the Torah mandates as 4. So it's sort of internal to the existing commandments of the Torah, and it's quantitative in nature. That seems to be a reasonable inference from Rashi's summary of the rabbinic thinking. But again, that's not self-evident. If when we looked back at the No Amendment Clause, it was unclear about what the scope of the No Amendment Clause was. What does it really mean, don't add? Perhaps it means, in addition to what Rashi says, it also means don't make up, don't fabricate, don't establish a new commandment. Say, oh, by the way, I had a great idea. Let's do this that is totally absent from and beyond the mandate of the Torah. I want to establish a new mitzvah to show my great piety. That could be encompassed within the no amendment, do not add clause. How about what I've just suggested? If I want to show my great piety by doing more than the Torah mandates, is that encompassed within the no amendment clause? That seems to be suggested by Rashi's summary, but it's not clear cut from the plain sense of the Deuteronomy verse. And taking the flip side about don't diminish, don't detract from the Torah. What about if I just fail to perform a commandment? Is that detracting from the commandment? Is it sort of a double violation? I'm not just violating that individual commandment, that individual prohibition not to do something, but I'm also violating the prohibition of not detracting from the Torah. So maybe even failing to fulfill any particular commandment is a violation of Bal Tigra, don't diminish from the Torah. So what I'm trying to point out is that Deuteronomy, the scope of the no amendment clause in Deuteronomy is not clear. It could be construed as broad in scope, that it might encompass, for example, don't make up new commandments, or Rashi seems to be construing it in line with the general thrust of rabbinic literature fairly narrowly. And I'm going to go on to explain, maybe starting today, but in the next 2 sessions, about why. Why would the rabbis construe the no amendment clause in narrow terms? Well, the short answer is, if they didn't construe the no amendment clause narrowly, their own enterprise, their own project of interpreting the Torah could be deemed problematic. So to give themselves more discretion in interpreting and fleshing out the Torah, the Bal Tosif, the no amendment clause, could not be thought of extremely broadly, even if its scope in the book of Deuteronomy was unclear. So again, Rashi understands it narrowly, and he's not making this up. He's deriving this from prior rabbinic literature. So he lived in the 11th century, and he's compiling this succinct comment from prior centuries of rabbinic thought in the Talmudic era. And again, just to sum up Rashi's summary, it seems to refer only to existing mitzvot, or it can be argued that the no amendment clause only applies to existing commandments, and it only applies in quantitative terms, in terms of altering existing commandments. Now, if one has that interpretation of Bal Tosif, of the no amendment clause in mind, there are all sorts of problems with it. Here's an example, and I could have drawn others. This is from the book of Kings. So this is in Tanakh. This is about King Solomon after the consecration of the first temple. So after the first temple was built by Solomon, and they had a whole ceremony to observe its sort of opening. It says, so Solomon and all Israel with him, a great assemblage from one end of the country to the other, observed the feast. When it says that Hechag, that always in the Bible and rabbinic literature refers to the feast of Sukkot. It was considered the great celebration. They observed the feast at that time before God 7 days, and again 7 days, 14 days in all. Well, as many of us know, the Torah said, observe Sukkot for 7 days. not for 14 days. So this seems to be an example of Solomon of his own discretion, doubling the length of observance of the festival of Sukkot in apparent violation of Rashi's summary of what the No Amendment Clause. Don't do that. Don't change numbers associated with our commandments. Solomon seemed to do that. The Tanakh does not seem to reflect any displeasure or disapprobation of Solomon's doing so. And so there are problems. I'm trying to identify issues with this this more narrow interpretation of what the No Amendment Clause was. The Tanakh itself seems to indicate there have been deviations from it in Jewish history. And I'm going to conclude, I see the time, I'm going to conclude with some other sort of problematic aspects of the Jewish tradition in light of Rashi's explanation of the No Amendment Clause, referring to quantitative terms that govern existing commandments. Numbers says, in the first month on the 14th day, and we just experienced this, that's why I'm including this example. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, there shall be a Passover sacrifice. So this is about the establishment of the holiday of Pesach. And on the 15th day of that month, a festival. So that's what we just celebrated, the beginning of Pesach. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. The first day shall be a sacred occasion. By Yom Harishon Mikra Kodesh, you shall not work at your occupations. Kol melechet avodah lo ta'asu. The Torah is telling us there shall be only one, essentially, 1 day of Yontif. You shall only have 1 day of holiness where you should not work. As we know, in Israel, there is only 1 day of Yontif, but in the diaspora, until today, through today, we have 2 days. Well, one might ask, and we're going to get back to this, it's an interesting topic, is having a second day of Yontif, as we just did, a second day of refraining from doing work, observing it in Shabbat-like terms, is that itself a violation of the commandment of Bal Tosif, you shall not add? Is it a violation of the No Amendment Clause? So here's another example. Deuteronomy says, when there's a dispute between people and they go to law and a decision is rendered, if the guilty one is to be flogged, so a punishment was lashes, the magistrate shall have the person lie down and be given lashes in his presence by count. The guilty one may be given up to 40 lashes. Arba'im yakenu lo yosif. You should not give more than 40, because if you exceed 40, you might be degrading him. So the Torah makes clear that the maximum number of makot, of lashes, and there's a whole tractate of the Talmud called Makot. It's an interesting tractate, but according to the Torah, the plain sense of the Torah is that the maximum number is 40. That's not what the rabbi said. If you look at the Babylonian Talmud tractate, well, this is the Mishnah about Makot, but there's a whole tractate of the later Talmud, the commentary on the Mishnah called Makot. But here in the Mishnah, so this is from the year about 200 CE, with how many lashes does one flog a guilty person sentenced to receive lashes? One flogs him with 40 lashes less 1, meaning a maximum of 39, not 40, as the Torah says, but 39. The rabbis say, no, the maximum is 39, and they draw it forth through their powers of interpretation, because the verse says by number 40. So the Mishnah joins the end of the first verse by number and the beginning of the second, 40, forming the phrase by number 40, which is interpreted as a sum adjacent to 40. So the rabbis, the majority view is, despite what the Torah seems to be saying, that the maximum number of lashes in terms of a punishment is 40, no, the rabbis are saying it's 39. Well, one could ask, doesn't that violate the No Amendment Clause? The No Amendment Clause, as interpreted by the rabbis, as embodied in Rashi's summary, says, no, don't mess with the quantitative aspects of my commandments. If I tell you 40 lashes, a maximum of 40, that's what it should be. Here, you're subtracting one. You're in violation of Baal Tigra. You shall not detract or subtract from the Torah. So this seems to be another pretty egregious violation of the no amendment clause. Now the rabbis had to rationalize this, and we're going to come back to it. I'm not going to leave you. If you come back to my next two lectures, we'll talk about how they navigated the strictures, the prohibitions related to the no amendment clause in arriving at certain determinations in the Jewish legal system that seem to be in violation of those no amendment clauses. And in fact, the rabbis were so sort of convinced of their own authority and capacity to interpret the Torah that once it was given at Mount Sinai by God, it was theirs to understand and interpret. Rava in the Babylonian Talmud said, how foolish are the rest of the people who stand before a Torah scroll, like we know during our Shabbat service and other services, when a Torah is near us, we stand. So they stand before a Torah scroll that passes before them, and yet such people do not stand before a great sage. And his example is the one that I just referenced, because a Torah scroll says you can get 40 lashes, but the sages came and subtracted one. So Rava is implying pretty strongly, we rabbinic sages have great stature and great power, really great power vis-a-vis the divine Torah, vis-a-vis the Sinai revelation, to dictate its meaning. Even though the Torah said you can give a maximum of 40 lashes, and again, Deuteronomy has a no amendment clause, we sages have the capacity to effectively change it and say, no, it's a maximum of 39. I'm going to stop there. And again, we're going to get back to how the rabbis rationalized the development of the Jewish legal tradition in light of these issues. So any questions or comments as we wrap up? Okay, so I'm not seeing any. Oh, yes, Shelley.
Hi, I want to also introduce Marty, who's a friend of mine, and he was very interested in this topic, so he wanted to attend, and thank you for allowing that.
Marty, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad you could join
Yeah,
us.
but I was thinking mainly about context. The word context kept coming up in my mind, and vis-a-vis interpretation, and also with regard to the to when a prophet might emerge. It seems to me, I mean, did that have any play in how you define whether to trust a prophet? In other words, if a prophet just came up now and said he was a prophet, or and was prophesizing, I couldn't possibly believe it, because the times that we live in do not support that. And again, in terms of interpretation, interpreting the Tanakh, the Chumash, I mean, how much does interpretation play in whether it's diminishing or adding to the Torah?
Okay, so those are two excellent questions, Shelley. I'll answer the first one, and I'll just note the issue of interpreting the Torah, we're going to come back to. I was just about to move to it on my source sheet, but we ran out of time. I'm going to get back to the very large issue of when the rabbis and when we interpret the Torah, does that border on this no amendment clause? If our powers of interpretation are extensive, when does an interpretation of the Torah that generates new meaning, when might that run afoul of the no amendment clause? So we're going to get back to that whole, it's a very large topic. We're going to get back to that topic of the rabbis were certainly interpreting the Torah. In doing so, did they have to be mindful of the no amendment clause or not? The first issue I want to get back to I want to answer now in terms of context. I agree with you. Now, if someone says, oh, God just spoke to me, and let me tell you what I've learned prophetically from God, most people would think that person is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not, I tried to bring text to show that that's not just a modern phenomenon. It's more of a modern phenomenon. We have more skepticism about, for example, the existence of miracles. I had a prior class about miracles. we have more skepticism about miracles in the modern world than people did in the pre-modern world. But here, with respect to prophecy, we saw that even the rabbis of the Talmudic era and Maimonides, so many centuries ago, had great skepticism about the existence and capacity of anyone being a genuine prophet in their own times. So yes, context matters. And I think classical Jews thought there were prophets in the biblical period, and there were miracles in the biblical period. I've given a prior lecture about was Hanukkah the last of the miracles in Jewish tradition? So there's generally a sense in Jewish thought, in classical Jewish thought, that prophecy and miracles, overt miracles and sort of overt prophecy, stopped a long time ago, and that's not just a modern phenomenon. Okay, anyone else?
Thank you very much.
Okay, so
Marc, I just want to make an announcement about, to remind everybody that about your Shabbaton the Shabbaton in your honor next week, and with what sounds like a really cool guy, the scholar who's coming. What is his name? Marc Shapiro.
yeah.
Jason?
So yeah, Benjamin, thank you. I was just about to do it, so I really
Please.
appreciate your reminding me. I'm going to conclude by saying, for those in the area, if you have not yet registered, we at Or Zarua are having a Shabbaton. It happens to be in my honor, but putting that aside, it's a really an amazing opportunity to learn from a fantastic scholar. I said in shul yesterday, so if you were there, you'll hear me repeat. I feel comfortable in saying you will never hear a more knowledgeable and sophisticated scholar of classical Jewish thought than you will hear next week, Professor Marc Shapiro, who will enlighten us with 4 lectures starting on Friday night through Shabbat afternoon. So he'll be on Friday night and in our Shabbat morning service, and then later during a Seudah Shlishit, the afternoon meal, on the theme that I've chosen based on his lectures of Torah and truth navigating the tension. The lecture I just gave sort of touches on that theme more generally, but Professor Shapiro is really an amazing scholar, both in terms of the substance of his scholarship, the cutting edge nature of what he says and writes about the Jewish classical tradition, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So I encourage you all to consider attending if you can. And even if you're not Or Zarua members, you are welcome. If you're attending my class, you are welcome to attend next week our Shabbaton. So I'm really looking forward to hearing and learning from Professor Shapiro, and I hope I'll see many of you there.
Great, thanks, Marc.
And I will be back at this time next Sunday at 10 o'clock for session 2. I have 3 sessions. And then I think there'll be a break for a couple of weeks. The calendar is complicated this year. That's why I'm starting during Pesach, which I've not done in prior years. So I hope to see you back for my class. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate your attending. Have a good rest of the day.
Marc.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. It was great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
My leave.